Hashem. Today's Daf Yomi is Menachos Daf Nun Zayin, and we'll start on the bottom of Nun Vav Amavei 56b, 4 lines from the bottom. Amar Rabbi Ami Hiniach Seor Al Gabi Isa. Let's say you put a piece of sourdough on top of some regular dough, V'hoach v'yoshavlo, and then what happened was the dough fermented on its own. Vinit chamtza me'oel, basically on its own it fermented. You put the sourdough there, but it didn't yet cause the chametz, the dough to leaven and become chametz. And then on its own it became chametz. Chayev oel kamasa Shabbos. You're liable for that, even though it's a passive action, just like you'd be liable on Shabbos. Ki agavna. So the Gemara says, "Ma'aseh Shabbos ki agavna mi mechayev." Are you really liable if you do a similar action to this on Shabbos, where you just put something, and when at the moment you put it, you weren't liable, but since you left it there, it became a prohibition? Is that really what you would be liable for on Shabbos? V'amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Rabba bar Chana tell us in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, we're on top of 57a. That if you put meat on top of coals on Shabbos, and it wouldn't be enough to cook it. If you didn't do another action, it wouldn't cook. So hipich bo chayiv. Only if you flipped it over would you be liable. Lo hipach bo pater. But if you didn't flip it over, you'd be exempt. So if that's the case, how come here you're liable by just putting the sourdough on top of the dough? The Gemara's question, at first glance, doesn't really make complete sense to me, because when you attach bread into the oven on Shabbos, you're liable, even though the baking does afterwards. Like, meaning at the moment you put the bread into the oven, you're not liable. The bread is not baked, but eventually it'll be baked and you'll be liable. And so also this case, you would be liable. But there's a distinction, really, because that's the way bread is typically baked. Well, here we're talking about a case where you put the sourdough on one side of the regular dough, and that's not the typical way in which you ferment the dough. So anyway, back to our Gemara. Amarava my chayev nami kedekam kamas etzli shal Shabbos. Without which Rabbi Amma said, you're liable for it, like the actions of Shabbos. His intent is not to compare it exactly to the actions of Shabbos, but he's just really intending to say that you're liable for putting it down, just like you'd be liable on Shabbos if you flipped it over. Now we're going to analyze the statement, a little bit of a tangent about the laws of Shabbos. Gufa Amar Rav Chama Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Yiniach basar dabek gecholim hipich bo chayev lo hipach bo pater. That if you put the meat on top of the coals, if you flipped it over, you'd be liable. If you didn't, you'll be exempt. Mara says, what are we talking about here? Hechidami. If we're talking about a case, that if you didn't flip it over, well, bashil wouldn't cook. Pshita, well, then it's obviously the case, then you're not liable if you didn't flip it over. You didn't cook it. So if we're talking about a case where if you didn't flip it over, it would anyways cook. Why wouldn't you be liable without flipping it over? So the Gemara says, so what's the scenario here? Well, the scenario is so we're talking about a scenario where if you wouldn't flip it over, one side would be cooked the sufficient amount, which is called machal ben drusai, like the cooking of either partially cooked or whatever, 1/3 cooked. The kamash milan, and so it teach the ilo play mitzad bishul mitzad echad kamachal ben drusai. But when you flip it over, bishul mishnei tzadim kamachal ben drusai. When you flip it over, it's going to be partially cooked on both sides. The Kamash one, and the Bryce is teaching us to call mitzad echad kamachal ben drusai lo kum. That if it's only cooked on one side, this method of machal ben drusai, this partially cooked, 1/3 cooked item, then we're going to say that it is not sufficient to be liable. It needs to be doubly cooked on both sides, like machal ben drusai, in order to be liable. Amarava ve'im nitzla bo kigregaris mitzad echad b'makom echad chayed. So he says, in addition to this teaching of Rabbi Rava, adds on to the teaching of Rabbi Yochanan, and he tells us I had said it was a Bryce, but obviously it was Rabbi Yochanan. Sorry about that. So Rava says, "Vim nitzlabo kigrogreris." But if on one side you roast it completely like the size of a fig, on mitzad echad b'makom echad, in one side, in one place, chayev. Even though you didn't flip it over, if it's roasted completely on one side, the size of a fig, you're liable. So the Gemara's the implication says Ravina Amar Ravina Ravashi. Does that mean b'makom echad in b'shnayim v'shloshim makom laslo? And only if it's cooked the size of a fig in one place will you be liable. But if you have to add up 2 or 3 different places to make the size of a fig, you wouldn't be liable. V'atanan. But didn't we learn in a Mishnah in Shabbos with respect to the prohibition of Shabbos, a different prohibition, not the prohibition of cooking, but the prohibition of making a hole. HaKodeach kolshu, if you make a small hole, any amount, you're going to be chayev. And the Gemara there says, Hechidami. And the Gemara analyzes, what are we talking about? What does it mean, the size of a hole, any amount that you're liable? If it's in one place, then what is a minuscule hole going to do? Why are you liable for it? So certainly we're talking about cases where you made a hole in 2 or 3 spaces, and therefore you're liable because you could combine the different holes into one big hole that you would be able to use. And so we see from here also with respect to roasting on Shabbos that you're liable even if it happened in 2 or 3 places. So why did we say it has to be only in one place? Gemara says no. And no, we're talking about a case with the holes that you made the hole in one place, and why are you liable? The chazu of baba da aklida became because you're able to put a small basically head of a key into it, and then you could put it into a box and thereby open the box. So you're going to make like a keyhole, and therefore you're liable. And others say, no, even if you roasted, back to the case of Shabbos, even if you roasted it so it would make a size of a fig in 2 or 3 places, you'll be liable. Didn't we learn this in the Mishnah? If you make any hole, you're liable. What are you going? What's a small hole in one place going to do? It must be that we're talking about 2 or 3 places that you can combine, and that's what we're talking about. The Gemara says no. So the Gemara says no. It's talking about, like we said before, that it could be made as a keyhole. It's in one place. So now the Gemara goes back to the prohibition of chametz with respect to a carbon mincha, like we said many times already now, that you're not allowed to make the carbon mincha into chametz. Tana Rabbanan, the Bryce says, if it says that which you bring to God, you're not allowed to make chametz. Hayisi Omer, ainly chametz. I would have said the only thing that is in violation of you're not allowed to make chametz is the kometz. Mincha minayim. What about the mincha before you do take the kometz, the flour and the oil and the water? Before you take the kometz, how do you know there also you're in violation? Tam Omer mincha. It says in the pasuk mincha. It says kol hamincha shetakrivu Hashem lo taseh chametz. So the mincha cannot become chametz. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, shar menachos minayin. How do I know all minchos, not just that mincha? So not just one specific mincha. So the Gemara, the Brisa says, Asher takrivu Hashem, which means to say, kshera v'lo psua. If you allow a kosher mincha to become chametz, you're chayev. A psua mincha, you'll be exempt. Let's say the carbon mincha became chametz, and then it left the azara after it became chametz. And then he went ahead and baked it. Now, do we say to keep it to yatsa since it went out of the courtyard? If Salah biyotze, it became disqualified. and now when he bakes it, lo, he shouldn't be responsible or liable for making chametz after chametz. O Delmore, maybe do we say, kivan de chimtza psula, apostle, since once it became chametz, in the first case it's disqualified, yotze or mahanibe, this prohibition of yotze doesn't affect it because it's already disqualified. And so therefore, you're going to be liable for chimutz achar chimutz in those circumstances. And the Gemara says, take it, we leave this question unresolved. Let's say the kometz becomes chametz while it's on the top of the altar, meaning after you brought it up to the altar in order to burn it, came chametz. Now, what will be the halacha there? Do we say asher takrivu amarachmana va'akrava? So it says that you're not allowed to make the kol mincha asher takrivu. You're not allowed to make the mincha that you bring. And this one he already brought, meaning say you brought it on the altar and you're not liable. Odilma mechusar aktara. Since he's missing burning it, it's like it's missing an action, and so therefore you're going to be chayiv. Take it, we leave it unresolved. The Gemara says, since we learn this out from the words mikoa mincha, asher takrivu, why does it need to say, after we learn from the Brisa, that there's Isser Chametz, not only on the Kometz, but also on the mincha, before the kometz was taken, asher takrivu lamali. What do we learn from these words, which implies that that only on the kometz that is there chiyuv. So we need to like the following price. Asher takrivu rabos minchas nisachem l'chimutz. Also, the nisachem you're going to be liable for chimutz, even though there's no shirayim for the kohanim there. You're liable for chimutz. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Akiva Omer Rabos Lechem Aponim. It comes to include the Lechem Aponim, the bread goes on the shulchan. That even though there's no kmitza and there's no portion to the altar, there's a prohibition of chametz. Minchas nesachem. The Gemara says, "What are you talking about? How come mincha of nesachem you be liable for chametz from there? It's just mei peirosim. It's just oil. There's no water there." There's just flour and 3 lugan of oil, and oil is made peros. And as we said 2 days ago, and as we said in the Gemara in Pesachim 35b, and now we're on the top of 57b, made peros a machmitzin. There's no chametz by made peros, so they can't become chametz. So what's the concern by the minchas nesachem? So Amar Eshlachash, Omer Rabbi Yossi Aklili, minchas nesachem megabel b'mayim ukshera. So he says, no, you do have to, according to Rabbi Akiva, what you would do is, Rabbi Yosef would say that you would put a little bit of water with the oil when you do the minchas nesachem, so therefore it could become chametz. Gemara says, well, what about Rabbi Akiva? Lechem aponim, that Rabbi Akiva says that there's a prohibition of chametz by lechem aponim. Midas yaveshi, meaning to say the utensil that you measured in is dry. You shemanale Rabbi Akiva damar midas yavesh lo niskacha. Rabbi Akiva himself says that this measuring utensil that they had in the temple was not a kli shares. You didn't have the kedusha of a utensil, and so therefore, when you measure the flour in there, it still wasn't sanctified. And so therefore it wasn't sanctified until it was placed on the table, the shulchan. And so therefore it wasn't called a mincha. So how would it become chametz? So Shoach Mishmei de Rabbi Yochanan, Kachi Atzah Shal Mishnah. This is the text of the Mishnah. The Epoch. It's corrupt. You have to read it like this. Asher takrifu, Rabos Lechem Aponim L'chimutz. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says that the Lechem Aponim become chametz. Rabbi Akiva says l'rabos minchas nesachem l'chimutz. Rabbi Akiva says that minchas nesachem is the prohibition of chametz. Ba'az Rabbi Yochanan Tamei. Rabbi Yochanan follows his logic. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yosef Glui ve'echam mitalmidav. Rabbi Yishmael Amru Davar Echad Umanu Rabbi Yoshai. The time they taught It says in the pasuk, and when the Mishkan was completed, they anointed the utensils and they sanctified them. Rabbi Yoshaya Omer, Midas Halach, the utensils, the measuring utensils for liquids, Nimshach Be'mi Bifnim Be'mechutz, were measured, were anointed both on the outside and the inside. But Midas Yavesh, Nimshach Bifnim Be'in Nimshach Mechutz. The measuring utensils are only measured on the inside, not the outside. Rabbi Yonasan Omer Midas Halach Nimshach Bifnim Be'in Nimshach Mechutz. Rabbi Yonasan says the liquid utensils were anointed on the inside, not the outside. Midas Yavesh or Nimshach Kol Ilchar. Rabbi Yonasan says they weren't anointed at all. And they don't sanctify. When are these shtei lechem going to be considered like they're for Hashem? Only after they're baked. So before they're baked, they're not sanctified. But what are they arguing about? About the word ba'osam. It says vayim shachem kadesh osam. Rabbi Yoshaya savar osam u'miute midas yavesh b'chutz. That when it says osam, only these utensils that have liquids in them, that Moshe anointed inside and outside to exclude the midas yavesh, the dry utensils, that they were only anointed on the outside. Rabbi Yonasan savar midas yavesh cholchu lo itzrakrahu mute. Rabbi Yonasan says the dry utensils are not sanctified at all, so you don't even need a pasach. It's only needed to exclude the liquid utensils from the outside. Rabbi Yonasan says, but why don't we say that Rabbi Akiva and one of his students, Rabbi Shmuel, they said the same thing, and that was Rabbi Yonasan? Why don't we say that? Gemara says no, mishum nelo shavu b'midas b'achadabi, because even though by yavesh they're saying the same thing, that they're both not sanctified, but there's a machlokas with respect to midas alach, that according to Rabbi Yonasan, midas alach was sanctified only on the inside, whereas Rabbi Kiva says that it was sanctified. We'll get to the sheet on the tzadi, both on the inside and the outside. Amoy Papa Abaye va'ika bisa delachu, but don't we have? Hold on. But don't we? How could the Gemara say that the dispute, that the machlokas is whether or not it was sanctified in a dry utensil or not? We could say that the prohibition of chimutz was talking about kneading in a bisa, which is a kli, which is used for the moist utensils. Amalek going shalosh agabe kabatulia. So the Gemara says that what Rabbi Akiva says, that there's no Easter of chametz when it's on lechem apanim. That's only where you didn't need the lechem apanim in a kli sharis, but rather you did it on a leather utensil, which is not a kli, and therefore it doesn't sanctify the bread. You're going to kaila bisaron dechol. So when Rabbi Yonasan proved it, when he said that the kli yavesh is not mekadesh until it's baking, maybe Yoshaya could have pushed it off and say that when they measured it in a measuring utensil of chol, that's what it's talking about. It depends which utensil. Gemara says no. It's not the same. Bishlam bisa will cost a rachman. They'll have a bisa or melishbei. Torah doesn't tell us to measure in a bisa. Kilash well gabi kapatulio. So if you measure it in this leather utensil, nothing's going to happen. Ela isaron, but the isaron keep it down. Rachmana avid isaron v'chayal. But since the Torah says to measure it in the isaron, shavik isaron the kodesh v'chayal isaron dechol, and so therefore, does the Torah tell us that you should not abandon the isaron of kodesh and use the isaron of chol? So it doesn't say that. So the Gemara says a new concept. How do we know that if you burn on the mizbeach the meat of the chatas or the meat of the asham with basar kachim, like the shalmei tzibor or mekachim kalam, moser omer, if you put on the altar from the kachim kalam or the omer moser shtei lechem lechem apanam mishiyar menachos shu below sasi? How do we know? How do we know that if you put on the altar the parts of the carbon that were not supposed to go on the altar, that you burnt them anyways on the altar, that you're in violation of the prohibition of the Baal Taktiro? Meaning to say, anything that is supposed to be a carbon to Hashem, anything that anything that was supposed to be burnt on the altar, you're not allowed to burn the part that was not supposed to be burnt on the altar. And so therefore, this includes the meat of the karbanos and the rest of the mincha and the 2 loaves of bread and also the lechem apanim. So the Gemara says, wait 1 second. The 2 loaves of bread and the lechem apanim, do they have any parts are burnt? Then we say that there's nothing there. Amar Rav Sheshes, Amy Gufo Ishim. The 2 loaves of bread and lechem apanim, they're not burnt from themselves, but there is something that is burnt that allows them. And so therefore it's the sheep by the Ishim and I think it's the Lavona by the Lechem Apanim. And so therefore there is something from them that is for the Ishim. All right, we'll stop here, Baruch Hashem. I'll stop here and we'll pick this up, God willing, tomorrow or tonight. Shkoyach.